Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Another Europe is Possible YouTube Live. This is organised as part of our Brexit Spotlight 60-minute briefing series. My name's Luke Cooper. I'm an academic at the LSE and a member of the Another Europe is Possible campaign. I'm going to be hosting today's discussion. You can join the debate yourself by using the chat function on YouTube as well. I'll keep monitoring it for your questions. This session is a rapid response to one of the big pieces of news this week, and that's, of course, the Northern Ireland Agreement. This is an issue that's full of legalese, it's full of technical detail, and even for people who have been following this debate, or should I say argument, super closely for years, it's very easy to get lost. And we're going to break it down into bite-sized chunks and help make sense of it for everyone, hopefully. We've got two guests joining us today who are absolute experts to deliver that nice explanation that we're looking for. Lisa Whitten is a research fellow at Queen's University Belfast, who in fact has written, I think, Lisa, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, an entire PhD thesis on Brexit and the Northern Ireland Constitution. We'll be getting some of the top lines in today's 60-minute chat. Sorcha Eastwood is a member of the Northern Ireland Assembly for Lagan Valley. I first met Sorcha in her campaigning for the 2019 general election when she was an electoral candidate. So it's great to have you back, Sorcha, talking about these issues as an elected politician in the Assembly. So congratulations for that. Lisa, let's get this show on the road and let's go straight to you. We're obviously, as I said, going back to basics today because it's easy to get lost in lots of technical detail very quickly. So let's start by, can you just give us a reminder of why the Northern Ireland Protocol was created, who negotiated it, and what was its aim?
Of course, and great to be here. Thank you for the kind introduction. So quick fire on the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's a legal text. It formed part of the UK-EU withdrawal agreement that set the terms by which the UK withdrew from the EU. So it was negotiated between the UK government and the EU themselves. Its stated aim in the text is to address the unique circumstances on the island of Ireland in the context of UK withdrawal from the EU. What are those unique circumstances? Well, in short, they are both geographic and historic. So on a kind of straight reading, Northern Ireland is the only part of the UK that shares a land border with another EU member state, Ireland. That creates complexities. It was always going to be the most visible outworking of Brexit and UK withdrawal. But also that the historic element is that Northern Ireland has a unique constitutional position under the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Part of that is facilitations for a unique level of north-south cooperation between Ireland and Northern Ireland, which is all to say that the implementation of Brexit as a new border regime between the borders of the UK and the borders of the EU was made even more complicated on the island of Ireland between Northern Ireland and Ireland than it would have been even if it was between two other countries that shared a land border, because you have this unique dynamic for north-south cooperation. That's also relevant here is the history of conflict and contestation on the island of Ireland. So the Belfast Good Friday Agreement of 1998, which is the basis for the constitutional position of Northern Ireland and from which its constitution arises. It's a peace agreement that was agreed about 25 years ago and that made reconciliation possible between two sides of the community here that are defined by their different constitutional aspirations. I'm sure we'll get onto this in a little bit more detail. But those who are unionists and who identify as British and want Northern Ireland to continue to be part of the UK, those that are nationalists and identify as Irish, and want Northern Ireland in future to potentially form part of a united Ireland. So in comes the protocol, and the aim of it was to address the complexities created on the land border and avoid a physical hardening of that land border in the context of Brexit. To do so, there were various iterations, and we could do a long history of Brexit, but to spare us that, speeding forward, the text that was ultimately agreed made a compromise whereby, for the purpose of movement of goods, new checks and controls would be implemented between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. This was, in colloquial terms, the creation of a so-called Irish sea border in respect of goods. The protocol also made arrangements to address certain other issues around energy markets, the rights of individuals, and North-South cooperation. As we've said, it does get techie pretty quickly, but that was the basic outline, that by avoiding a hard border on the island of Ireland, new checks and controls between Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
That's a super clear explanation, and thanks so much for that. And so why did it become such a point of contention? I mean, you've touched upon this already, the distinction between orange and green, nationalist and unionist. So this agreement, we've already heard, it's a pretty unique agreement for the European Union. We'll come on to that later. And part of that uniqueness is obviously recognising the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process. But suffice to say, unionists that want to keep Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom didn't like this agreement. Could you outline that for us and why?
Agreed. Yes, so it was quite contentious in its implementation. So the compromise that was at the heart of the protocol, that, as you acknowledged, the EU kind of made quite an exceptional arrangement to allow the UK, part of the UK, to continue to access the e-single market in Northern Ireland, but the implementation requires EU law to continue to apply in Northern Ireland, where it doesn't apply in the UK in respect of Great Britain. So from a unionist perspective, and political unionism here felt that the implementation of new border checks and a border regime between Great Britain and Northern Ireland was undermining Northern Ireland's place within the UK, and also both the UK internal market. So there's a kind of technical, practical side of the economic implications of those checks and controls, but also on a more fundamental level, a sense of kind of constitutional undermining and a watering down of unionist sense of Britishness. So the political unionism in Northern Ireland reacted very negatively to the implementation of the protocol. It's also true to say, and I'm sure we'll come on to this in a bit more detail, that it was contentious, its implementations contentious between the UK and the EU, with mutual accusations of bad faith. So from a UK perspective, there was accusations that the EU were implementing it too harshly, and from an EU perspective, that the UK was reneging on commitments that it made and not implementing it. So fair to say its implementation wasn't smooth, which is where we end up today.
Yeah, and of course it's kind of objectively difficult thing that both sides were undertaking, and then at the same time you add all that history and politics over the top. The long history of difficult politics in Northern Ireland, of course, is one thing, but then the politics of Brexit is extremely difficult and polarized in Great Britain too, so that didn't help. And then you had this phenomenally technically hard agreement to try and pull off. And of course, as we'll come on later, actually for Northern Ireland, if you like, exiting the UK single market would have serious economic ramifications for Northern Ireland too. So those objections can't be easily dismissed. But Sorcha, let's bring you in now. What did the Alliance Party, and again, congratulations on your not so recent now election, but congrats nonetheless. What did the Alliance Party make of the original protocol? And you were opposed to Brexit. How did that shape your view of what the protocol was trying to do?
Thank you so much, Luke, and thanks for the invite to be here. It's great, and great to hear from Lisa as well, who has been really instrumental in terms of trying to make sense through her work at Queen's of a really difficult subject. So Alliance, for those who don't know of us, are a very unique party in Northern Ireland insofar as we are made up of people who are unaligned, so people who are neither unionist or nationalist like myself, and people who are maybe unionist or nationalist but don't prioritise that issue and don't put it first. And for those reasons, I think that the role of Alliance over the last number of years, 6, 7 years, has been even more critical, because a lot of the time people looked to us as a party for a voice of not reason, but people looked at us as a voice of a party that articulated a lot of views, unionist, nationalist and unaligned like myself. We're a proudly European party, we're a proudly internationalist party, and sadly we had our first MEP just elected before we actually left the EU, so we were very passionate about playing our part in terms of European and global politics. But for us, the kind of onset of Brexit, and I even remember that speech that David Cameron gave back around 2011, talking about the concept of an in-out referendum, and it did fill me with a little bit of dread, but I kind of thought, like many other pledges that came through the coalition that failed, that might be one of them, but sadly that didn't happen. And I think one of the biggest fears that I had about it was that it would rip away this umbrella that so many people in Northern Ireland felt comfortable under. So a European umbrella, a British umbrella, an Irish umbrella, a Northern Irish umbrella. And of course, as Lisa has outlined, although the Good Friday Agreement was a political settlement, it really kind of enabled and almost in a way copper fastened that kind of all-island element, not just in economic terms, but in terms of working towards mutually agreed European goals and domestic goals as well. And sadly, at the minute, we can see just how important that role is in terms of European goals working together in terms of the energy crisis, the war in Europe with the invasion of Ukraine, and dealing with cybersecurity and ongoing geopolitical issues such as climate and other threats. So for those reasons, we felt deeply uncomfortable about Brexit. We obviously opposed it. Whenever we came through what we call the iterative process that arrived at the actual protocol itself, we voted against the protocol in the House of Commons. We didn't want to have barriers erected anywhere on the island or in the sea, but we accepted the reason and the rationale for the protocol existing. What we have found particularly difficult to take at times has been the hypocrisy or maybe the short-sightedness of those who didn't actually think through what it was they were calling for. And I could obviously give you a political opinion on that and say, I think the DUP and others backed Brexit thinking they would have the luxury of it not being successful. And then having to live with the consequences of that outcome. And I think that's been replicated in UK politics across the whole of the UK. A lot of people have talked about the Ulsterisation of UK politics, where it became very binary, where it became very aggressive and adversarial. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I feel strongly that whenever this idea was dreamt up, Northern Ireland was even less than a footnote in terms of people's considerations. And I think that really came through in terms of the Johnson concept and attitude to it. What we would say very briefly, just in concluding, is that what we have through the Windsor framework is nothing that wasn't already on the table. We regard the data sharing that came in with Rishi Sunak and that resetting of UK-EU relations as being key. And of course, that was on the table from the last year, 2 years. But what enabled this progress was the development of trust. And I look forward to our conversations as we progress through the Zoom on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we're looking at this whole situation as positively as we can, it does seem to me that one thing that has died a death this week is the Dominic Cummings view of how you negotiate with the European Union, and that must be a really good thing. So basically, and indeed Lord Frost too, the more horrible, the more difficult, the more uncompromising, the more belligerent you are with your closest allies, the more likely you are somehow to get an agreement. So this kind of bullying approach to international relations, because as you say, in that Fintan Toole has I'm sure you have both seen it already, a great Guardian column on this a day or two ago. That has really died a death. But Lisa, let's go back to you now. And Rishi Sunak has clearly, tried to turn the page on the Boris Johnson era. Could you give an outline of the deal the UK and EU have negotiated? This is obviously, as we've already said, a potentially massive question, and we'll try to avoid to make it too techy. But what were the main areas of disagreement between the UK and EU? And basically, how did the deal attempt to resolve those areas?
Okay, so I will endeavour to keep it as light on the technical detail as possible. As you say, it is inherently a bit nerdy. But so what we have in this revised agreement, under the protocol, the setup was that goods moving from Great Britain into Northern Ireland were by default presumed to be at risk of going on into the EU single market via the land border. Therefore, checks and controls, quite a high level of checks and controls, were required to be carried out at the ports and airports of Northern Ireland. One of the areas of key disputes was between the UK and EU over goods that were coming to Northern Ireland but staying in Northern Ireland, but they were deemed under the protocol to be at risk of moving on into the EU and treated as such, whereby they would have to keep aligned with EU standards and undergo a lot more bureaucracy than was ever the case when it was just within the UK. So the solution to that particular movement of goods issues and goods staying and being used in Northern Ireland is this green lane, red lane approach. So under the Windsor framework, we have provisions for goods that are moving into Northern Ireland and staying in Northern Ireland and can demonstrate as much. There's a labelling system and a trusted trader system that's being used to facilitate this. And as Sorcha mentioned, data sharing is really key in facilitating a lot of this. And that's why trust is so central. But for green lane goods, so traders moving and wanting to, who can declare that their goods will stay in Northern Ireland, they're subject to a whole lot less checks, a whole lot less bureaucracy, and there won't be checks carried out to make sure they are those goods are in line with EU standards. You also have a red lane, so if you can't determine that the goods that are coming into Northern Ireland will remain in Northern Ireland, then they will enter through a red lane where the customs checks and regulatory checks will be carried out. So that's the key in what's been agreed here. The second aspect, second key area, is around what was broadly discussed as the democratic deficit of the protocol, the fact that Northern Ireland continues to follow along with a specific selection of EU law, but has no role in determining what that law is or any changes to it. So this was a dynamic setup. It would be following EU law in perpetuity as it changed. So there's a series of provisions made in this. The key one, the one that's been getting all the headlines, is the Stormont break, which no doubt we will discuss more. And it's quite a novel setup, which will allow 30 MLAs, a section of MLAs from at least two parties, to register concern, make a notification to the UK government if and when a new piece of EU law that would, under the agreement, under the protocol come Windsor framework, apply automatically in Northern Ireland, those MLAs can say if they don't want that to happen, and they can prove that it will have a lasting and substantial effect on the lives of people in Northern Ireland, they can make a case to the UK government that that shouldn't apply. The UK government can then bring that into the institution that oversees this framework and the agreement, and the joint committee with the EU, and decisions can be taken, including the non-application of the change or amendment or replacement that the MLAs have raised as a concern. So quite complicated. I think it's also fair to say, and this has been getting less headlines, but in addressing that democratic deficit aspect, and it should be read together with the storm and break, is new structures and commitments to allow Northern Ireland representatives to have a say in the oversight and management of this novel setup that it has of continued access to both the UK and EU markets. So at an earlier stage of the process, and kind of more inherent in the process of the implementation of this, Northern Ireland voices will be there. Then the final thing I'll say just on the substance of the agreement is that it addresses a series of kind of specifics, so specific issues that had come up in the 2 years of implementation so far of the protocol, which, fair to say, it's a very untested system, and some unforeseen and some kind of just consequential issues arose. These include, a big one was the supply of medicines. So there's been a kind of carve out to ensure the supply of human and veterinary medicines to Northern Ireland continues, hopefully smoothly without being at risk, and it would have been at risk due to the nature of the previous arrangements. Also, pets will no longer have to go through the rigmarole. The pet owners, if they're moving their pets in and out of Northern Ireland and in and out of GB. There's a provision for parcels. Previously, there would have been new bureaucracy for anyone wanting to send anything from Great Britain to Northern Ireland and vice versa. So that's kind of been carved out of the otherwise checks and controls and bureaucracy, so that's good. Also seed potatoes and plants and a whole series of issues around VAT, but I'm aware that those are even more niche than what I've already mentioned, so I can pause there and we can chat more.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for that. It's really, really great to have such a clear explanation of all this detail, and it's good to hear that dog owners and cat owners in Northern Ireland have got something really concrete out of this negotiation too. Can I ask a follow-up question? And I don't know the answer to this, so I'm going to be listening really intensely myself. So look, I've seen it argued that the EU and UK are framing the respective deals in quite different ways to their two audiences. And does this potentially store up problems for the future? Basically the UK government is really emphasising that there's only 3% of EU law now being transposed to Northern Ireland. And then on the EU side, they're arguing that this deal fundamentally protects the integrity of the single market. It's hard to see how both of those arguments can be true at the same time. So is one side wrong on the substance of the deal and the other right? Really looking forward to hearing your answer on this question.
Okay, so I would say, first of all, that one of the quite transformational aspects of the last couple of weeks for those who've been watching this is the joint messaging of the UK and the EU. That's something that we run polling through our research, and there has been majority support and kind of request from people in Northern Ireland for clearer messaging and, where possible, joint messaging from the UK and the EU. So I do think we should acknowledge the significant shift in that, and how, as those who are affected by it, it's helpful if there can be a level of coherence in clarity in terms of what is being communicated as to what has changed and what hasn't changed. That said, I do take the point that there is very clearly, or well, I would describe it as a difference in emphasis between the UK and the EU in how they're communicating the change that's been made. On the EU side, there's perhaps more of an emphasis on the agreement as a framework, as a framework that allows for progression and evolution and still needs clarification. Fair to say, there's a lot of this, all of this is still draft, and there are details to be worked out, legislative initiatives and drafting to be done, consultations to be carried out. But on the UK side, and this I think is perhaps the key difference in messaging, it is being portrayed as this is the end of Brexit. This is the solution, this is fixed, this is final point. And that does create somewhat of a tension, although it is also the case that the UK government are invested in this relationship, and the substance of the texts set up a new way of working between the two sides. On the 3% of EU law and the extent to which this really does diminish the relationship between Northern Ireland and the EU's legal order, that one's a bit more, if we get into the details, it is invariably techie, and there are still unanswered questions, I would suggest, about how alignment will continue in Northern Ireland. So EU law does still apply in Northern Ireland in specific sectors and under novel arrangements, and that's really quite key. The testing of this is yet to come, really. Also, I would perhaps cheekily suggest that 3% of EU law is a bit of an arbitrary stat, although it might look nice on a press release. As someone who spends a lot of time looking at EU law, 3% can be, that tells us nothing about the policy impact of that. And you can read it differently in how you want to make the calculation. But I think it is fair that this arrangement is less legally onerous on the statute book in Northern Ireland. However, the arrangement is complex, and we might get onto this in a bit. A lot is going to be asked of representatives in Northern Ireland and the stakeholders, business communities in Northern Ireland, in terms of how they can implement this. They can, if and how they can really use this for the benefit of Northern Ireland, and I would be hopeful in that regard. But it's no easy task, and it's not a task that anyone's done before. So there are still there are complexities, some unanswered questions, and that difference in messaging, although it's to be welcomed, the joint messaging, the difference in emphasis is always going to be a bit less than ideal. If you can get clarity, it's always helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on this difference in messaging over whether Brexit is ever done, I think is going to be hugely important to the politics of how this plays out in the future. The EU, I think, quite correctly recognise that that Brexit is never done, that it's an ongoing process of negotiation. And on the politics, I just want to take the opportunity. I think a number of viewers watching live, and we will get to your questions in just a moment, will have seen this video on social media over the last 24 hours. It's a video of Rishi Sunak heralding the deal that he's struck for Northern Ireland in rather interesting terms that indeed Remainers might agree with.
Is in the unbelievably special position, unique position in the entire world, European continent, in having privileged access, not just to the UK home market, which is enormous, 5th biggest in the world, but also the European Union single market. Nobody else has that. No one. Only you guys, only here. And that is the prize. I can tell you, when I go around the world and talk to businesses, they know that. They're like, that's interesting. If you guys get this sorted, then we want to invest in Northern Ireland, because nowhere else does that exist. That's like the world's most exciting economic zone.
Right, Sorcha, let's go back to you to give your immediate reaction to Rishi Sunak's comments. It really did sound like he was making a case for joining the European Union right there. If it's so good for Northern Ireland, why wouldn't it be great for the rest of the United Kingdom?
Yeah, I thought you were going to ask me about that video. And I have a bit of an insider perspective on that, because actually that had taken place in the Coca-Cola Hellenic Bottling Company factory, which is in Lisburn, which is right in the middle of my constituency and is my home. And it also happens to be the constituency of Jeffrey Donaldson as well, who is the leader of the DUP and an MP. Although we'll see for how long that will continue. But basically, the situation is fascinating, because what some of your viewers may or may not be aware of is that there was a call. We'll take it back a little bit more than that. So take it back to last February, whenever the Assembly was collapsed by the DUP. And they collapsed it because they said they couldn't thole the protocol in existence anymore. They couldn't deal with it. And we were absolutely appalled, along with all of the other parties, that they had done this. And it was towards the end of the mandate. So there's an argument to say, did they do this purely from a theatrical perspective in the mouth of an election? But regardless, for us, it was an irresponsible and selfish move. What we have seen in the last number of weeks is the Prime Minister, several hardline Brexiteers, members of the ERG, even former negotiators such as David Davis, people like Steve Baker, even today Andrea Leadsom saying, people should want to invest in Northern Ireland. This is a fantastic deal. And we're still looking at the DUP, who have not said that they will go back in. And it's almost like disaggregating two issues. So one of the issues is, how do we all read this Windsor framework, right? Because as Lisa has eloquently outlined, it's very dense, it's very legal, it's very technical. And for us in Northern Ireland, then there's the separate issue, which is the DUP should always have been back. So the essay question today really should be, why are the DUP still not back at the Assembly if this deal is now in place? And I think there is a real power struggle going on within the DUP at present. They are the largest unionist party, and they should be taking up the role of Deputy First Minister if the Assembly is up and running. And what's really crucial about that, and for some of the more longer term Northern Ireland fans, is that we're almost in a situation where Jeffrey Donaldson is in a similar position to David Trimble back in 1998, whenever he had to take a courageous step for unionism. As a party, we provide leadership. We had our best ever election result just a few short months ago in the last Assembly election, where we increased our amount of MLAs from 7 to 17. So that goes to show the depth of feeling in Northern Ireland for people who want something different, who want to move forward, who don't give a damn about someone's political perspective or, any other view that they may have. And for the rest of us, we're now saying we should have reform of the institutions to enable us to go in and to govern and to take up the role of Deputy First Minister and have ministers in place and actually govern the country. In terms of the actual substance of what we've seen so far and what we understand, the Stormont break is something that, although we've given a broad welcome to the Windsor framework, the Stormont break is really something that we would really like to get further clarification on and bottom out. For some of your listeners, they may be aware of the petition of concern and how that's previously worked in the Northern Ireland Assembly. It's been used to block things such as equal marriage, which we obviously consider to be an egregious breach of human rights. And it's also been used in several other debates over the years. I think also in terms of blocking Irish language rights and rights of other people in our community. So it's clear that in Northern Ireland, if you throw a tool into the mix that may be used to either vexatiously operate the institutions of state or enable some sort of a veto, you can bet your bottom dollar that will absolutely be used and abused. What we have in the last few days is an element of stability where we know where we are. Although I think you're absolutely right, Luke, in saying that this is a matter of maintaining long-term good relations between heads of agreement, UK and EU, but also North-South and East-West. And although the deal, such as it is firmly closed, albeit maybe slight presentational or just working through maybe a few bumps in terms of the text, it's done. And they're certainly not going to go back into it or review it or agree it. But what we do need to have is really that resetting that we've seen under Sunak continue. I would argue that hopefully the Conservatives are coming to the end of their electoral time in government, but that's maybe for another day. But regardless of who is leading the government in the UK, we need to have that continue. And I think what's probably unsaid in Northern Ireland is that I think a large part of this is to do with the economic problems that have really pervaded the UK since they Brexited. But obviously we've had the trust premium impacting the UK economy. We've had several major incidents in terms of massive bust-ups within the Tory party. And I think Sunak is trying to extricate the Tory party from electoral oblivion. Maybe that ship has already sailed and it's too late, but certainly I think that trust between Sunak and those negotiators in the EU was key. As Lisa has already said, the data sharing element of it opened up all these possibilities. And the only reason that didn't happen sooner was because Johnson and, as you said, Cummings, Frost and others really made a virtue almost of being as belligerent as they could and undermined that trust. And I suppose just in concluding that, we definitely saw the end of that whenever the protocol bill was scrapped, or at least a commitment from Sunak to sideline that and scrap that, because that was almost the ultimate in bad faith in terms of legislating. So that's kind of where we are at the minute.
Absolutely. And Lisa, like Sorcha then has just mentioned the petition of concern. So maybe we could pause on that a moment, because I think that probably needs a bit more explanation for our viewers. So petition of concern, this is the principle in the Good Friday Agreement of cross-community power sharing. And if one community has an issue where they say, we want to block this, we think in one way or another it's an infringement of our community, and under the principle of power sharing, we're not prepared to accept it. They need 30 members of the Northern Ireland Assembly to sign this petition. What happens then? And presumably when it comes to this stormont break, I think it's been argued that they can't just use it for very, very small issues or things that aren't of great significance. Could you explain that for us? Because you've already mentioned 3% of EU law is a lot.
Great, yes. So I will endeavour to explain. First just on the petition of concern and what it is in practice in Northern Ireland. Governance setup, as you say, it's a provision to it's designed to allow minority rights, minority communities to stop things being done on majority consent, pure majority consent, and that they're uncomfortable with. Suffice to say, over the years since it was introduced in 1998, it has been reformed and it has been used, and reports have suggested abused in terms of, as Sorcha was outlining, it's been used frequently and for issues that it wasn't designed to address. But in terms of procedure, as you say, so to initiate a petition of concern, vote on a particular motion, you need 30 MLAs from 2 parties, this is at present, to lodge a petition against a given motion in the Northern Ireland Assembly. Then that triggers a vote that will require cross-community consent to be achieved in order to pass. And there are 2 ways in which cross-community consent can be achieved: either a majority of Unionist and Nationalist designated members, Sorcha, feel free to correct me on this because this is off the back of my head, voting that would pass. If a majority of Unionist and Nationalist MLAs vote in favour of the motion, that gets cross-community consent. Alternatively, you get a weighted majority whereby 60% of the MLAs present and voting agree to the motion, and 40% of those who are Unionist and 40% of those who are Nationalist also vote in support of the motion. Okay, so that's quite techy, and to set that out, that's the petition of concern as it operates in the Northern Ireland governance setup. Under the Windsor framework, it is different. So as I understand it, and as it's been confirmed to me just in the last few days, although caveats apply and disclaimers apply because we're still getting to grips with this stuff, under the storm and break procedure, if a change is being made in EU law that would automatically apply in Northern Ireland, then like on to the petition of concern process, if 30 MLAs from at least 2 parties believe this will be counterproductive, don't want this to happen for Northern Ireland, and can demonstrate that it will have a lasting and significant effect in Northern Ireland, then they can lodge a petition. That petition then goes to the UK government, and they're framing this rather than petition, but as notification. So the UK government get a notification of this kind of half of the petition of concern procedure having been carried out in relation to a change in EU law. Then the UK government can take that, if they agree with the MLA's case that they've made, that this will have significant effect in Northern Ireland, they're uncomfortable with it, then it's for the UK government to take into the UK-EU Joint Committee and to carry out consultations on what might happen there. So crucially, as it's set out initially, the storm and break doesn't require a cross-community vote to take place after the 30 MLAs from 2 parties lodge a concern notification. However, the details are still to be worked out. And so when that notification is given to the UK government, it goes to the Joint Committee, they hold consultations. The government have said that they are considering in the process of resolving or moving forward on any such scenario and specific issue of notification, there may be a process to then hold a cross-community vote in the Assembly on whether or not ultimately to apply the relevant change or an amended version of the relevant change, but that would only happen after consultations have taken place. So it is techy, and it's also not fully clear as to how exactly it'll work, but hopefully that gives you an idea of how the 2 processes sit together.
No, you've done a brilliant job, Lisa, in laying it all out, because as you say, it's both techie and still unknown. So Sorcha, let's go to you with my final question, then we'll take the audience questions. So as I understand it, you correct me if I'm wrong here, I was looking at the figures, the DUP and Traditional Unionist Voice, which is the very hardline Unionist party, they don't actually have 30 representatives in total. So it's actually quite difficult. Am I correct there? In then using this break, they would need the support of the Ulster Unionists. And I was also looking at some of the long-term data, and I suppose this is a bit of a soft question for you, but the long-term trend in Northern Ireland Assembly is, of course, to the rise of parties like Alliance, the non-aligned. So is there a concern in terms of how this is going to operate then, that the non-aligned don't have much of a say here, over the Stormont break, or potentially, I mean, especially on the cross community principle, of course, historically is designed to protect the historically oppressed nationalist Catholic community, but now it's this really important vehicle for the unionist community on this wide range of levels. So I just wanted to give you a chance to comment on that, and then we'll go to some Q&A.
Yeah, so I mean, this is one of these odd scenarios where actually during some of these sorts of votes, and Lisa, you keep me right here because it's such a head melt. Basically, because we are an unaligned party and we designate as other. Whenever I signed into the Assembly last May, I signed in as United Community. Other MLAs will sign in as Unionist or Nationalist, just simply that. But because as a party we are neither Unionist or Nationalist, and I personally am neither Unionist or Nationalist, my vote does not count in the same way. So what we don't want is a baking in of a situation where our votes are not counted. And that already stands as it is, even if the Assembly was back up and running, and that's something we have called for reform of for a long time. It's clearly not fair whenever our vote seems to be growing almost exponentially, where we now have, a situation where it's almost three blocks, where we are all minorities in Northern Ireland. Nobody has the majority per se anymore. And we don't want to have a situation where we're using this situation of the break. And as Lisa says, we're still trying to find our way around it. Listen, it says the bar has to be high, and it says the issue has to be incredibly important in terms of persisting, long-lasting societal change. But I didn't think that we would leave the people of Northern Ireland without an assembly at a time of great health crisis over the head of seed potatoes. So, you'll forgive me for being, if not a little cynical, slightly skeptical, that people will not seek to utilise this break in a vexatious way, essentially. What we want is a situation where the stability that has been given through the Windsor framework is not damaged by potentially a series of attritional constant votes. We all know that EU directives are voluminous. And they are very, very frequent. And we don't want to see a situation where not only are we cut out, but it also damages the actual discourse and leads to further acrimony at a time when we don't need it. So that's basically where we are in terms of the Stormont break at the minute.
Yeah, thank you. And we're going to audience questions, but I'll give you a chance to think about this one. You've got a question around whether you would ever support a united Ireland. You can think about that. We'll go to Lisa now. Lisa, can you answer the question for us around basically there were various questions around the economy and the economic benefits for Northern Ireland of this agreement. What are businesses and other economic actors in Northern Ireland saying about the potential economic benefits? And do you, as I guess an observer here, do you think it's going to have an impact if Northern Ireland is seen as very prosperous relative to Great Britain? I mean, it's notable. I remember at one point in this debate that Northern Ireland was experiencing food. There was questions around the supply of food to supermarkets in Northern Ireland. Now, of course, the UK as a whole has this kind of quasi food crisis in certain goods, and it's not entirely unrelated to its Brexit deal. So impact of Northern Ireland's deal on the rest of Great Britain, how do you see it?
Good question. So on the economic aspect and potential economic benefits, what business think? With the caveat and disclaimer that ought to be made throughout that this is as yet untested and that we're still getting to grips with the details. Broadly, the economic actors and business representatives in Northern Ireland have really welcomed this deal. It's more comprehensive than they perhaps thought might come forward, and particularly for movement of goods and retail goods for supermarkets. There's a lot to be said about the Green Lane system. But they're working out the repercussions in detail, of course, over the next while. In terms of the benefits more broadly, for the potential for Northern Ireland to kind of flourish under its unique arrangement, and speaking back a little bit to the Prime Minister's characterisation of it, I do think it's worth saying just again, right back from the very beginning, that Northern Ireland is in a unique circumstance in the context of post-Brexit, the post-Brexit world, and that unique circumstances has invariably costs and benefits, and the creating a setup that allows for the smoother movement of goods in and out of Northern Ireland to both the UK internal market and the EU single market is to be welcomed. Northern Ireland is not the wealthiest part of the UK. There are lots of issues. The legacy of conflict is evident still in our economy, in our societal structure. For some, it's still a lived reality. And I think that can sometimes be lost in the context that this is a region that has so much potential and so much possibility, but hasn't flourished in all of its history as yet. So if this can be for the benefit of Northern Ireland, I do think it's important, while I understand the difficult hearing for those who very strongly opposed Brexit, that the Prime Minister's words might be, they are said in the context of the uniqueness and unique position of Northern Ireland. And remember that it's dealing with divergence, both on that East-West GBNI axes as well as the North-South Ireland, Northern Ireland axes, and that will always come with potential real benefits and also costs and complexities. I realise I've talked a bit around the issue there. Could go into detail about the economy, but can send links perhaps because it's a bit more niche.
No, that's really helpful. And I think with the other element of Rishi Sunak's speech that was quite clear, that I think you touched on as well. I mean, sometimes I think the politics in the rest of the UK, Great Britain, as I guess we have to call it now, so it sometimes forgets that Northern Ireland still has these legacies of conflict. I mean, when I visited, you visit the peace walls and everything. I mean, it's still a shock to see that up close. And of course, we've had the recent killing of the police officer as well. And so there's a danger, as you suggest, of just talking about this in terms of an economic success story in the making, when all of those challenges and difficulties still persist and require sensitive politicians. But Sorcha, let's take you in to answer that question on the border poll, because there is a kind of political discussion underway now with civil society in the north and south of Ireland around a possibility of a border poll, some mechanisms, historically weak vote for the Ulster Unionist parties in the Assembly. What's your take on this discussion?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting time to be involved in politics in Northern Ireland, no doubt. But funny, what we had said, and I'm coming at this from absolutely no skin in the game here because I'm neither unionist or nationalist, and I come from a very mixed background in terms of my own family and my own life experience. It's funny because we had sort of encouraged the DUP and others, if they had a union and maintaining the union at the forefront of their mind, surely a good protocol that maintained access to both markets would have been a way of strengthening potentially some of the economy and economic opportunities in Northern Ireland that brings. And it's funny, I don't want to get this wrong. So Lisa, if I've quoted this wrong, you keep me right. But David Jordan, the economist out of Queen's, who did a paper on the disparity of the Northern Ireland economy from its inception. Did I get the name right? Yeah, I think so. So he has done a really interesting piece of work in terms of the economy of Northern Ireland since the inception of the state in 1921-22. And you can see where there have been clear long-term economic structural problems with Northern Ireland. Initially, whenever Northern Ireland was created, it was almost the economic powerhouse of the island of Ireland. And it had textiles, it obviously had a huge shipbuilding industry, and then obviously the war boosted some of that production, if that's the right word to use. But then we saw that really fall into decline in the time of the Ulster Unionist reign of Stormont, from the period of the 50s until it was prorogued in 1973, I think it was, or after Bloody Sunday anyway. And what we've seen since then are several attempts to kickstart Northern Ireland's economy throughout the likes of Ledu, under various direct rule ministers, David Needham being one, people who sought to kind of exploit various chances through FDI into Northern Ireland through the US. And as Lisa has rightly pointed out, you know, we are not a rich place. We have an awful lot of social and economic deprivation. And of course, we're struggling to come to terms with the legacy of the conflict here. And that presents, you know, challenges in terms of both health and our politics. But what's interesting is that it's arguable that although there had been some kind of further engagement around a conversation about what a new Ireland would look like, and that's fair enough, let that conversation crack on, absolutely. We're certainly not going to stand in the way of that. But I wonder, has this outcome today, maybe for some different liberal unionists, actually maybe given a string to their bow, where you could say, well, actually, if Northern Ireland has access to both markets, and we're trying now to really capitalise on that foreign investment, does that actually further cement the union? Or over time, will people vote a certain way, which will inevitably end up in a numbers game where already unionism is not a majority in the assembly. But that's whenever people like me then come into play, because we don't have an axe to grind from one place or the other, but it certainly is a very interesting time.
Yeah, absolutely. And can I ask a tiny quick follow-up question on that? I mean, in your constituency, Lagan Valley, I mean, you have won part of the moderate unionist vote. So if you're standing, is what you're, one way of reading what you're saying is that you would be much more worried politically about standing against moderate unionists arguing how you just argued in terms of the protocol than you would hardline unionists. Is that a fair interpretation of what you've said?
I think it's probably not for me to speak for unionism because I'm not a unionist, but I don't think we're going to hear that argument from either unionist party. The TUV obviously is extremely hardline, and Jim makes absolutely no bones about that, and fair play to him. But I don't think we're going to hear that pitch from the DUP or the Ulster Unionist Party, because arguably they would have already made it, and I don't think they're going to make it. I think particularly in Lagan Valley, where the DUP have been so dominant for so many decades, and the Ulster Unionist Party before that, they're in real difficulties down here, and that's because people are fed up with the politics of ransom, the politics of wrecking, and they look at somebody like me, who was only 11 whenever the Good Friday Agreement was signed, and lived through my fair share of how that impacted on my family, and they see someone like me standing up for everybody in the community and want to kind of champion that for themselves and for their family and their future. So we're not concerned at all or nervous about anyone making that argument. And even if they did, that wouldn't be a bother to us at all. We're in a situation where we have at the minute a mandatory coalition. So frankly, it suits nobody not to have a strong, confident unionist partner until such times as that's changed to a voluntary coalition, which incidentally is something we have called for since around 2002 as a party. We need that strong partner in unionism. And the great shame at the minute is that unionism is leaderless. We're providing leadership for people in Northern Ireland, but obviously it is for unionists to want to have that from parties that they vote for purely from a unionist perspective, and that's absolutely legitimate. But I think there is a real question, as you've sort of picked up on there, in terms of where is unionism going to go. We just want to make this place work, and if there are other conversations going on about other future settlements, we're perfectly happy to feed into those, and we have fed into those. So yeah, we just want to try and crack on and get on with government, and we're very, very frustrated and angry that we can't do our jobs whenever we see people suffering in front of us.
Great, thank you so much for that. I mean, we are at time. Can I, Lisa, do you have a couple more minutes? I just have one more question from the audience, actually. How does this relate to citizen rights? Are citizens of and it's a great question. It's a little bit of a big question. Are citizens of Northern Ireland, well, they're not citizens of the EU, but are they citizens of the single market? What's the answer to that huge and important question? What kind of citizenship rights do people of Northern Ireland have?
As is often the case when it comes to Brexit, Northern Ireland and its outworkings, the answer isn't exactly straightforward. So the protocol, now Windsor framework, contains specific protections for citizens' rights in Northern Ireland under Article 2 of the now Windsor framework. And that's linked to protections that are outlined in the 1998 agreement. There are also a series of additional protections for citizens who have Irish citizenship in Northern Ireland, which is one of the possibilities under the 1998 agreement. You can have British or Irish or both. That means that if you have an Irish passport in Northern Ireland, you still get free travel. You are still an EU citizen. However, you're an EU citizen outside the territory of the EU. So you don't have full access to the EU single market in the way that someone who is resident and a citizen in an EU member state does. But you do have additional protections and implications of your EU citizenship rights there. For those who are neither Irish nor British, but are perhaps EU citizens that have settled status, that system works similarly to GB, except under the exceptional setup of the arrangements for Northern Ireland under the Windsor framework. You do have additional rights and protections associated with participation in the EU single market for goods primarily. And this is also an interesting aspect of one of the key topics in the debate here and across the UK has been around the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice of the EU. But it's not often recognised that continued jurisdiction of the Court of Justice when it comes to matters for Northern Ireland traders or individuals, that continued jurisdiction provides an additional forum for the rights of both legal persons and actual persons to be upheld and recognised, as well as UK courts. So that's an additional dynamic that goes on there. I realise that's like a non-answer, but the thing is, there's now, post-Brexit context in Northern Ireland, there's a kind of new diversity of the rights protections that are available, and it's contingent on what category you fall into as a person. There are additional rights associated with the unique setup in the Northern Ireland context, and that comes out of the rights, the importance of rights in the 1998 agreement and in our constitution. Yeah, sorry.
Well, that was an absolutely brilliant and flawless answer on a really tricky question to get right at the end of this discussion. But thank you so much for coming on and talking to us. I think it's been so enlightening and useful on every level. And we as in people in Great Britain, as we're calling it, the rest of the UK, I mean, we just don't talk about Northern Ireland enough in these kinds of forums. So we really appreciate having your insight and involvement in this chat. We're going to wrap it up there. To everyone who's been listening, thanks for tuning in. And we will be running another one of these Brexit Spotlight 60-minute briefings in a couple of weeks. We would always urge you to join the Another Europe is Possible campaign to support these initiatives. You can go to anothereurope.org/join to do that. Thanks for watching, and thanks again to both our brilliant guests in today's conversation. See you next time.